rain had been falling in quiet, persistent sheets since mid-afternoon, turning the village of Kingswell into a glistening labyrinth of puddles and mist. In the heart of it, Abernathy Manor stood like a brooding relic of another age, its stone walls darkened by centuries and the tall windows glowing faintly in the gloom. It was here that the crime took place, one that would be discussed in hushed tones for months to come, though at first no one could agree on whether it was an act of desperate cunning or sheer madness. Colonel Arthur Abernathy had been dead for 6 months. Heart failure, so the village doctor said, and nobody questioned it. His widow, Margaret, was a woman of 53 with the kind of composed elegance that kept gossipers at bay, though she inspired endless speculation. They said she had loved her husband in her own distant way. They also said she had little tolerance for fools and no patience for melodrama. But on that rain-heavy evening, when the small household gathered for supper, melodrama arrived uninvited. The household was small. Mrs. Abernathy, her companion and secretary, Miss Evelyn Shaw, the Colonel's old friend Major Henry Ketteridge, and a visiting solicitor from London, Mr. Lionel Price, who was attending to some final matters of the Colonel's estate. Dinner was a quiet affair until the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. Evelyn lit a candelabra, and the small golden circle of light gave the room an almost conspiratorial air. Margaret Abernathy, in her low, deliberate voice, suggested they finish the meal before worrying about the outage. "The generator will be along directly," she said. But 10 minutes later, when the butler did not return and the house remained in darkness, Price offered to check the fuse box. He left the dining room by the side door, his figure swallowed by the blackness of the corridor. He never returned. When they found him, it was half an hour later. The lights had come back on, and Price lay slumped on the tiled floor of the library, one hand still clutching a sheet of paper. His face was pale in death, eyes fixed in what could only be described as surprise. There was no wound, no sign of struggle, no scent of poison in the air, nothing that offered the faintest clue to how he had died. But the paper in his hand was strange indeed. It was a page torn from a dictionary. The definition of the word widow was highlighted with a thick, uneven line of blue ink. Nothing else. The police, when they arrived, seemed almost annoyed by the lack of progress they could make. Superintendent Frobisher, a broad man with a fondness for certainty, inspected the scene with narrowed eyes. "Natural causes," he announced. "Likely a weak heart. Man was a city fellow. Might have been the shock of the outage." But when Dr. Connolly examined the body, he shook his head. Price's heart had been strong. The cause of death was, to put it mildly, unknown. Miss Marple, who had been staying with a distant cousin in Kingswell and heard of the incident from the grocer's assistant, was at once intrigued. She arrived the next morning, ostensibly to bring Margaret Abernathy her condolences. The widow received her graciously, but there was a faint reserve in her manner, as though she were aware that Miss Marple's keen blue eyes missed nothing. "It was dreadful, Miss Marple," Margaret said, pouring tea with mechanical precision. "One moment we were speaking of the estate, the next—" She trailed off, her gaze flickering to the library door. "The police can make nothing of it." "And this paper he was holding?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Margaret's expression did not change, though she set down the teapot a fraction more carefully than necessary. "The police think it a coincidence. Perhaps it was in his pocket." Miss Marple sipped her tea and made a small, non-committal sound. She doubted the word widow had found its way into the dead man's hand by chance. More curious still was the fact that the library's dictionary, when she asked to see it, was entirely intact. No pages missing. That night she walked past the manor on her way back from the vicarage and paused beneath the dripping eaves. A faint light glowed in the library. Through the curtains she could see Margaret Abernathy sitting at the desk, head bent, her hand moving across a piece of paper. She seemed to pause often, staring into space as though listening for something, or perhaps remembering. The next day brought more strangeness. The butler, a grey-haired man named Crawley, confided to Miss Marple that he had seen Mr. Price in the library the morning before his death. "He were looking through the Colonel's old dispatch box," Crawley said. "Said Mrs. Abernathy gave him leave, but she were in the rose garden at the time, I know that for certain. And then there was the matter of the locked window. The library had 2 tall sash windows that opened onto the west terrace. One of them, Crawley reported, had been found locked from the inside that night. The other had been unlatched, but rain had been falling steadily, and yet the carpet beneath it was dry as bone. Miss Marple had seen enough locked-room puzzles to know that this was no ordinary oversight. Someone had wanted it to appear that the window had been untouched. The final, most curious point came from Evelyn Shaw. She admitted in a moment of flustered honesty that she had heard voices raised in the library the previous evening, Margaret's and Price's. It was only for a minute, Evelyn said, twisting a handkerchief. Then Mrs. Abernathy came in to dinner as if nothing had happened. A man dies with no apparent cause, clutching a single torn page marked "Widow," a locked window without a drop of rain beneath it, an argument denied, a dispatch box opened without permission. Miss Marple saw the shape of it forming faintly like the outline of a figure through a fogged glass. The trouble was the shape was all wrong, too simple perhaps, or much too neat, and that, she knew from long experience, was the most dangerous kind of puzzle. The villagers called it a tragedy. Miss Marple called it an invitation. The morning after Mr. Price's death was a muted affair. A thin sun broke through the clouds, but the air still carried that washed-clean smell of a village rinsed by steady rain. The authorities had been in and out of Abernathy Manor, their questions precise, their interest already waning. Superintendent Frobisher, with the weight of officialdom on his shoulders, had seen nothing but an unfortunate, inexplicable collapse, possibly some obscure medical condition. His men gathered statements, dusted for fingerprints in a perfunctory manner, and took the dictionary page into evidence without the faintest curiosity as to why such an object might have been clenched in a dead man's fist. Miss Marple, of course, saw things differently. She had an eye for the incongruous, those details that sat uncomfortably against the rest of the picture. As she crossed the gravel path toward the manor's front steps, she noted the butler Crawley polishing the brass door handle with unusual vigour. His motions were brisk, almost anxious, and he avoided looking at her. Inside, the house had that particular hush which follows an unspoken agreement not to speak too much. Mrs. Abernathy was in the drawing-room, reading a letter with the careful stillness of someone conscious they are being observed. Evelyn Shaw, pale but composed, was arranging flowers in a porcelain vase, her fingers trembling only when she thought no one was looking. Miss Marple accepted a seat and let her gaze travel, not openly, but in that way of hers, as though her eyes rested idly on one object after another while her mind tucked away each observation. The fire in the grate had burned low, and yet the ash was oddly clean, as though someone had raked it through recently. By the writing desk, the Colonel's dispatch box sat closed, but the small brass key on the ring beside it did not match its lock. A small thing, perhaps, but small things had a way of growing into large explanations. Mrs. Abernathy was speaking, something polite about how disruptive the whole business had been, when Evelyn dropped a sprig of ivy. She bent to retrieve it, and Miss Marple noticed the faintest flush rise to her cheeks as her eyes flickered toward the window. It was the unlatched one, standing just wide enough to let in the cool morning air. On the sill lay a faint smudge of something that could have been ash, or perhaps fine soot. Miss Marple did not stare, but she remembered. After tea, she took a turn about the garden under the guise of admiring the roses. She found the west terrace and stood beneath the two library windows. The rain had left the flagstones slick, but beneath the unlatched window the ground was dry in a neat half-moon just under the sill, as though something had shielded it from the downpour, a ladder perhaps, or some other obstruction. When she returned inside, Superintendent Frobisher was at the door, preparing to leave. He gave her a genial nod. "Nothing much to be done here, Miss Marple. The doctor will put his name to a cause of death soon enough, and that will be the end of it. London fellow, no enemies in the village, nothing stolen. Case closed, if you ask me." "I'm sure you're quite right," she said, in that agreeable tone that meant she was sure of no such thing. But it was not until she passed through the hall that she caught sight of something that made her pause. By the umbrella stand, half hidden behind a heavy walking stick, was a small leather satchel, one she had not noticed the day before. Its flap was buckled, but the leather strap was twisted unnaturally, as though it had been yanked hard. Crawley, coming down the corridor, froze for a fraction of a second when he saw her glance toward it. Then, with a swift, almost rehearsed motion, he picked it up. "That belonged to Mr. Price," he said quickly. I'll see it return to his people." "Very kind of you," Miss Marple murmured, but she noticed he carried it with the ease of someone who already knew its weight. She would have liked very much to know what was inside. Later, when Mrs. Abernathy excused herself to take a telephone call in the study, Evelyn found herself alone with Miss Marple in the drawing-room. The young woman's hands were busy with the flowers again, but her thoughts seemed elsewhere. "You were in the library that evening, before the lights went out?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Evelyn hesitated. "Only for a moment. I was looking for a book Mrs. Abernathy had mentioned." "And Mr. Price was there?" "Yes." A pause. "He seemed rather agitated. He asked me if the Colonel had ever mentioned something called the Gibraltar Papers. I told him I'd never heard of them. Then Mrs. Abernathy came in, and he went very quiet." Miss Marple let the words settle. Gibraltar Papers. A torn dictionary page marked "Widow," a locked window with a dry patch beneath it. She could not yet see how they fit, but she knew each was a thread. The trick would be in finding the knot where they all met. By the time she took her leave, the afternoon light was thinning, and the village seemed to hold its breath. At the gate she passed Major Ketteridge, his greatcoat buttoned high, and his expression unusually grim. He tipped his hat but avoided meeting her eye. Miss Marple noticed that his gloves were flecked with something pale and powdery, ash perhaps, or plaster dust. That night, as she sat knitting by the window of her cousin's parlour, she thought of Mrs. Abernathy's steady composure, of Evelyn's quick glance toward the window, of Crawley's careful guarding of the satchel. Above all, she thought of that dictionary. Page, the deliberate blue ink marking the word "widow." It was not simply a message, it was a choice. But whose choice, and why, remained just beyond her reach. The next day she decided she would return to Abernathy Manor, not for tea nor condolences, but for answers. Miss Marple arrived at Abernathy Manor the following morning, under the respectable pretext of returning a shawl Evelyn had lent her the day before. The staff had already grown accustomed to her quiet presence, and she was ushered into the drawing-room without delay. Mrs. Abernathy was there, writing at her desk, her pen scratching steadily across thick cream paper. She looked up with her usual poise, but there was a slight hesitation before she smiled. "Miss Marple, how very kind. Evelyn will be delighted to have her shawl back." "I thought it best to return it promptly," Miss Marple replied, taking a seat uninvited. "And perhaps to ask a question or two. Purely out of curiosity, of course. A silly habit of mine." Mrs. Abernathy's lips curved faintly, though not with amusement. "Curiosity can be useful." They spoke for some minutes about the weather, the roses, the state of the roads. Then, with an almost imperceptible shift, Miss Marple said, "I hear there was some discussion in the library between yourself and Mr. Price shortly before dinner." Mrs. Abernathy's pen paused mid-word. "We had a difference of opinion over the handling of a small bequest in my husband's will. Nothing more." "Of course," Miss Marple said mildly. "Yet I was told he seemed agitated, perhaps even nervous." A long pause followed. "Mr. Price had a nervous disposition. London men often do." And with that, Mrs. Abernathy bent over her letter again, effectively ending the subject. Miss Marple took her leave soon after, but instead of heading for the front door, she wandered toward the library, where she found Major Ketteridge studying a book on the history of military campaigns. "Major," she said cheerfully, "you were with Mr. Price that evening?" "Only briefly. We discussed the Colonel's service in Gibraltar. Old times, you know. He was interested in some of the papers Arthur had kept. I told him they were not for public eyes." "Not for public eyes?" Ketteridge cleared his throat. "Merely confidential. Old military matters. Not important now." Price seemed disappointed, but I assumed that was just his professional curiosity as a solicitor. Miss Marple glanced at his gloves, which rested on the arm of a chair. They bore faint grey smears, ash or dust. "And you were in the library when the lights went out?" "I was in the hall, about to fetch a drink. Couldn't see a thing when the darkness came. I thought the man had simply gone to the fuse box. Never imagined." He shook his head, letting the sentence trail away. It was a neat story, and yet Miss Marple recalled Evelyn's words. Mr. Price had grown quiet the moment. Mrs. Abernathy entered the library. No mention of the Major at all. Her next call was to Evelyn herself, whom she found in the morning-room polishing the silver. The girl's eyes darted toward the door when Miss Marple approached, as if fearful of being overheard. "I wonder, my dear," Miss Marple said softly, "whether Mr. Price was in the library alone when you saw him before dinner." Evelyn hesitated. "He was, until Mrs. Abernathy came in. I didn't see Major Kettridge there at all." "And did you hear what was said?" "Only a few words. Mr. Price was asking for something. Papers. Mrs. Abernathy told him firmly they were destroyed long ago. He didn't believe her. Then I left." Miss Marple nodded, as if the matter were clear as day. "And you, my dear, you didn't think to tell the superintendent?" Evelyn looked stricken. "Mrs. Abernathy asked me not to mention it. She said the police would misunderstand." When Miss Marple left the morning room, she encountered Crawley in the hall, carrying the leather satchel she had noticed before. This time she stopped him. "You're very careful with Mr. Price's belongings, Crawley." "Of course, madam. The man's people will want them intact." "Quite so. And what did he keep in that satchel?" Crawley's eyes shifted. "Papers, I think. I never looked inside." "You didn't?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but the silence that followed pressed heavily. At last, Crawley muttered, "There was a sealed envelope, addressed to someone in London. But it's gone now. I suppose Mr. Price had it with him when it happened." Miss Marple let him pass without further question. She had learned long ago that too much pressure too soon could make a liar close up like a clam. By late afternoon she had 3 distinct versions of the evening. Mrs. Abernathy admitted to a disagreement about the will, downplaying it as trivial. Major Kettridge placed himself in the hall at the crucial moment and claimed Price had been interested only in military history. Evelyn insisted Price and Mrs. Abernathy had been alone in the library, arguing about documents the widow claimed were destroyed. And Crawley? Well, Crawley's story about the satchel was vague enough to invite suspicion. What intrigued Miss Marple most was not the differences in their accounts, but the eagerness with which some of them had tried to smooth away any suggestion of trouble. It was not the behaviour of people with nothing to hide. That evening, as she walked back to her cousin's cottage, she reviewed the facts in her mind. A solicitor comes to a country manor to settle an estate. He dies without apparent cause, clutching a page marked "Widow." The night before, he was seeking documents, Gibraltar papers, from a dispatch box that did not match the key beside it. A window unlocked but dry beneath it, a satchel missing its contents, gloves dusted with ash, and a fire grate too clean for a rainy evening. Too many careful erasures, Miss Marple thought. Someone had been tidying the scene, not just physically, but in their stories, and the more tidying there was, the messier the truth beneath it must be. She smiled to herself. Tomorrow she would begin to untidy it. The next morning broke cold and bright, the kind of light that seemed to strip the mist from the hedgerows and show everything a little too clearly. Miss Marple, however, was thinking not of sunshine but of shadows, those cast by motive, where the edges were never neat and the shapes never quite what they seemed. She arrived at Abernathy Manor under the pretext of returning a small book she claimed she had borrowed from Mrs. Abernathy years ago. The truth was that she wanted to see all of them, widow, companion, old soldier and servant, gathered under the same roof, preferably where she could observe them in the same room. She had learned that motives, like weeds, often showed themselves when grown too close together. Mrs. Abernathy was in the drawing-room, with Major Kettridge by the fire, and Evelyn arranging a tea-tray. Crawley moved silently in the background, his eyes as guarded as ever. Miss Marple settled herself in a corner chair, knitting in her lap, and began to tug at the loose threads of conversation until the first knots appeared. "I've been thinking," she began conversationally, "how very sudden poor Mr. Price's visit must have seemed. I don't imagine you had much warning, Mrs. Abernathy." The widow looked up from her correspondence. 2 days' notice. He wrote that he had final matters to settle in connection with the Colonel's estate. And were those matters entirely financial? There was the briefest pause before she replied, "To my understanding, yes." Though Mr. Price was thorough. He liked to examine every scrap of paper. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Even the Colonel's private dispatches? Kettridge shifted in his seat. Those papers were irrelevant, purely historical. Arthur wouldn't have wanted them shown around. There were delicate matters from his Gibraltar posting. Evelyn, who had been pouring tea, glanced sharply at the Major before looking down again. "Delicate," she echoed. Ketteridge cleared his throat. "Old service disputes, not for civilian eyes." Miss Marple let that settle, then turned her attention to Evelyn. "And you, my dear? You knew Mr. Price before this?" "Number though, he seemed to know a great deal about me," Evelyn said quietly. "He asked if I'd been with Mrs. Abernathy long, if the Colonel had ever discussed his military affairs with me. I told him no, of course, but he hinted that there were things in the past best not spoken of." "That's often true," Miss Marple said mildly, "though it does make one wonder why he came all this way if silence was the aim." It was Crawley, silent until now, who spoke. "He wasn't. Here, just for the will. I heard him in the library with the Major the day before. They were talking about a letter. Price said it would ruin someone if it came out. Then Mrs. Abernathy entered, and the conversation stopped." Ketteridge's jaw tightened. "That's a damned exaggeration. Price was speculating, making a mountain of nothing." "But speculation can be dangerous," Miss Marple murmured, "especially if one stands to gain from its suppression, or, indeed, its revelation." She watched them all closely. Mrs. Abernathy's stillness was the calculated stillness of someone aware they were being measured. Evelyn's hands moved too quickly with the teacups, as if she feared breaking something. The Major's fingers drummed on the arm of his chair, betraying a soldier's impatience. Crawley kept his gaze lowered, but Miss Marple did not miss the faint curl at the corner of his mouth when the word ruin was mentioned. The web was there. It only needed shaping. Greed was obvious enough. Mrs. Abernathy had inherited the Colonel's considerable estate, and any challenge to the will could have threatened her position. But greed was rarely the only strand. Revenge had its place too. Perhaps Ketteridge, whose military career had ended abruptly, feared something in those Gibraltar papers might blacken his name further. Evelyn might have feared for her livelihood, should a scandal attach itself to her employer. And Crawley, a discreet servant, could make himself indispensable by what he knew, or by what he could destroy. But none of these explanations quite fit the locked window, the clean ash in the grate, or the missing contents of the satchel. Those were acts of someone not just protecting themselves, but deliberately reshaping the scene. "Tell me," Miss Marple said softly, "where was everyone when the lights went out?" Mrs. Abernathy's answer came first, crisp and precise. "In the dining room, until Mr. Price left to see to the fuse box." "In the hall," Ketteridge said immediately. "Pouring wine," Evelyn murmured. "In the pantry," Crawley offered. The statements overlapped just enough to sound consistent, yet something in the timing was wrong. If Price had left the dining room, passed Ketteridge in the hall, and then reached the library, how had Evelyn seen him there before the lights failed? And Crawley's pantry alibi was as thin as tissue. One could come and go without notice when the house was in darkness. Miss Marple rose slowly as if the matter were concluded. "It's all quite clear," she said, her voice deceptively airy. "Every one of you had cause to keep something from Mr. Price, and each of you has taken pains to say you did not. Now, the truth is usually more interesting than denial, but it does take a little coaxing to come out." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes narrowed a fraction. "Are you accusing us of something, Miss Marple?" "Not at all, dear lady," she replied. I'm only remarking that when 4 people tell 4 versions of the same story, it is rarely because the story is dull. It is because the truth is inconvenient to someone, and convenience, I've found, is the most dangerous motive of all." She left them in silence, but as she stepped out into the crisp morning air, she felt certain the maze was beginning to take shape. The trouble with mazes, of course, was that they could be run in circles forever, unless one knew precisely where the centre lay, and she meant to find it. The breakthrough, when it came, was the sort that made the local papers certain the case would be tied up neatly before supper. It arrived in the form of a smudged envelope, discovered by a young constable while helping Crawley clear the unused attic rooms. The envelope was addressed to Mr. Lionel Price, in a looping, old-fashioned hand, and contained a single folded letter, half-burned, the edges curling inward like black petals. The legible portion was enough to stir every official in Kingswell. It mentioned the Gibraltar papers, and ended with the words, Should these come to light, the truth about the Colonel's widow will be plain. The effect was immediate. Superintendent Frobisher arrived at Abernathy Manor before the afternoon tea had cooled, clutching the evidence as though it were a war medal. He laid it on the drawing-room table in front of Mrs. Abernathy with the air of a man expecting a confession before the hour was out. "Looks bad, madam," he said, his voice almost apologetic. "Price had this in his possession. Points to you, doesn't it?" Mrs. Abernathy examined the paper without visible distress, then placed it gently back on the table. "If you mean to imply I killed Mr. Price to prevent some revelation, you are mistaken. The letter is unsigned. For all we know, it's the work of a malicious crank." "Crank or not," Frobisher said, "it was found in your house, hidden away." "That's enough to put the matter squarely in our sights." Major Ketteridge leaned forward. "Really, Superintendent, it's not like Margaret, Mrs. Abernathy, to dabble in such theatrics. Price could have brought that letter with him." Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the corner with her knitting, noted the quickness of Ketteridge's defence and the faint twitch in Evelyn's fingers as she poured tea. Crawley stood near the door, eyes fixed firmly on the carpet, though his jaw worked as if chewing some private thought. The superintendent was not in the mood for subtleties. "We've got a letter tying the deceased to an accusation, and we've got the accused in possession of it. I'll be making my report to the coroner. Cause of death still pending, but the motive's right here in black and white." It was all very tidy, too tidy, in Miss Marple's opinion. She had seen before how a case could be wrapped up in paper and string, only to unravel entirely when tugged at from the right corner. This letter had appeared far too conveniently, and the fact that it was half-burned suggested not desperation, but design. Frobisher left the manor in high spirits, confident he had his answer. The village buzzed with speculation. A few already whispered that Mrs. Abernathy might be taken to trial. She, for her part, maintained a calm dignity, though Miss Marple noticed a subtle tightening around her mouth when anyone mentioned the attic. That evening, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage under the guise of delivering scones. She knew the vicar's wife had a cousin on the village council, and news travelled along such lines faster than the post. Sure enough, by the time the tea was poured, the talk had turned to the damning letter, and how clever it had been of the police to find it. "I expect she'll be out of the house before winter," the vicar's wife said with satisfaction. Miss Marple merely smiled and nodded, but in her mind she could see the pieces shifting. If Mrs. Abernathy truly feared the Gibraltar papers, she would have destroyed every scrap long ago. Why leave a letter in her own attic? And if she had meant to burn it, why only half? No, the letter was a plant, something intended to lead the police toward a convenient suspect and away from the real danger. The next morning she returned to the manor on the pretext of asking Evelyn for a recipe. As she waited in the morning room, she allowed her gaze to wander. On the mantel was a small brass matchbox, its lid still warm to the touch. A thin curl of ash lay beside it, finer than what a fireplace would produce. Paper ash. Evelyn entered moments later, cheeks flushed from the garden. "Oh, Miss Marple, you startled me," she said, setting down a tray. "I've that effect sometimes," Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. "Such a shame about that letter, half-burned like that. So inefficient, don't you think?" Evelyn froze, just enough for the pause to register, then laughed softly. "Perhaps the attic draughts blew it out before the job was done." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. But in her mind the image sharpened. Someone standing over a candle, letting the flame eat just enough of the paper to be dramatic, before tucking it away for discovery. Someone who needed the suspicion to settle firmly on Mrs. Abernathy, while keeping their own hands clean. By midday, the newspapers were hinting at new and compelling evidence. Frobisher was already speaking as though the matter were solved. The manor, for all its heavy walls and muted colours, seemed to hum with tension. Miss Marple could feel it, like a wire drawn tight, ready to snap. She sat in the library that afternoon, ostensibly reading, and watched the movements of the household. Crawley avoided the library altogether, staying near the service entrance. Ketteridge paced the terrace, smoking, glancing up at the windows as if weighing something. Evelyn passed through twice, each time glancing, at the desk where the dispatch box sat, and Mrs. Abernathy remained mostly in her rooms, emerging only for meals, her expression unreadable. Yes, Miss Marple thought, the letter had given everyone a sense of false relief. Everyone except the person who knew the real business was still unfinished. That person was waiting, confident that the wrong suspect was about to be cornered and ready to act before the truth could surface. And if her instincts were correct, the next move would not be to flee but to strike again. The wind had turned sharp overnight, rattling the bare branches along Kingswell's lanes. Miss Marple rose early, not because she had pressing errands, but because her mind had been working steadily through the small hours, turning over a single stubborn question. Why Gibraltar? The word had been mentioned too often, in too many guarded tones, to be the mere footnote of the Colonel's service history. She began her search not at the manor, but at the little reading room above the village post office, where old newspapers were bound into cracked leather volumes. With the help of Mrs. Atwell, the postmistress, she located issues from the spring of 1923, the year Colonel Abernathy had been stationed in Gibraltar. It took an hour of careful page-turning before she found it. A short piece, half buried on page 6 of the Gibraltar Gazette. A British officer, one Captain Lionel Redfern, had been accused of selling confidential shipping schedules to a foreign agent. The case had collapsed due to insufficient evidence, but the article hinted at whispers of a cover-up. Redfern had been quietly sent back to England, his career in tatters. The name meant nothing at first, until Miss Marple noticed a smaller article, published 2 months later, announcing the marriage of Miss Margaret St. John to Colonel Arthur Abernathy. Margaret Street John, Mrs. Abernathy. Miss Marple sat back, her knitting bag at her feet, feeling the pieces shift. Margaret Abernathy had been in Gibraltar at the time, likely knew the disgraced Redfern. Could there have been more than a passing acquaintance? And how might that connect to the present? Back at the manor, she found Major Kettridge on the terrace, staring into the brittle sunlight, with the air of a man listening for news he did not want to hear. "You served with the Colonel in Gibraltar, I think," Miss Marple began, her tone light. Kettridge glanced at her. "Yes, 1922 to 24. "And you knew Captain Lionel Redfern?" His reaction was small but telling, a tightening at the corners of the mouth, a flicker in the eyes. "Knew of him. Bad business. Abernathy did his best to keep the scandal quiet." "And Mrs. Abernathy? Was she acquainted with him?" Kettridge's gaze shifted to the gardens. "She was a friend of his sister." A pause. "Why do you ask?" "Because," Miss Marple said mildly, "Mr. Price seemed particularly interested in Gibraltar. I think perhaps he knew something the rest of us have not considered." When she went inside, she found Evelyn alone in the morning room, sorting through a box of old correspondence. At the sight of Miss Marple, she quickly shut the lid. "Ah, I see you've been tidying," Miss Marple remarked. "Is that the Colonel's?" "It's Mrs. Abernathy's," Evelyn replied, a touch too quickly. "Old letters, nothing important." "Nothing to do with Captain Redfern?" Evelyn's hands stilled. "Where did you hear that name?" "Oh, in the course of my reading. An unfortunate case, never proved but seldom forgotten." Evelyn hesitated, then lowered her voice. "Mrs. Abernathy asked me to destroy anything with his name on it. She said it was to avoid embarrassment if the newspapers got hold of it. But I kept one letter back. I don't know why." She fetched it from the box, a thin sheet, brittle with age. It was addressed to my dearest M, and spoke of papers that could clear my name, and the Colonel's promise to keep them safe. It was signed simply Lionel. So the Gibraltar papers were not incriminating after all, at least not to the Colonel. They might even have exonerated Redfern. But why would that be dangerous to Mrs. Abernathy now, so many years later? Unless their emergence would reveal that she had been more than a bystander in the affair. Miss Marple's final call that day was to Crawley. She found him polishing the silver in the dining room. "Tell me, Crawley," she said gently, "how long have you served the Abernathys?" 24 years, madam, since Gibraltar. And you remember Captain Redfern?" The butler's expression remained blank, but his voice was low. "I remember he trusted the wrong people. I remember the Colonel taking risks to shield him. And I remember Mrs. Abernathy asking me, personally, to ensure certain papers were never found." "And you obeyed her?" "I did then. I'm not so sure now." That admission was more than Miss Marple had expected. She thanked him and stepped out into the fading light, her mind knitting together the threads. A scandal buried decades ago, a widow whose past was tangled with the disgraced officer, an old friend of the colonel who knew too much, a servant who had helped hide the evidence, and a solicitor who came seeking those very papers, and wound up dead. The crime in the library had not begun with Mr. Price's arrival. It had begun 22 years earlier in Gibraltar, when a young officer fell under suspicion, and a young woman, Margaret St. John, chose loyalty to one man over the ruin of another. Now, someone had decided the past should remain buried, and they had killed to keep it so. Miss Marple knew she was close, but she also knew that when the roots of a crime ran this deep, pulling at them could bring the whole tree down, and the person in the shadows would not let her do it without a fight. Miss Marple spent the night in quiet contemplation at the vicarage, her knitting untouched in her lap. The threads of the case lay before her in her mind, tangled but beginning to separate. Gibraltar, the missing papers, Mrs. Abernathy's peculiar composure, and Mr. Price's ill-timed demise. What she needed now was not more questioning. Every suspect had perfected their alibis, but a moment in which one of them would forget to be careful. By morning she had decided on her method. It was an old trick she'd once seen employed by a very sharp schoolmistress in St. Mary Mead. Present people with a small, fabricated fact and see who flinches. The truth, Miss Marple knew, has a certain confidence about it. Lies are forever glancing over their shoulders. She began by visiting Mrs. Abernathy under the pretence of delivering a borrowed book. The widow sat in her drawing-room, dressed in deep blue, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Miss Marple, after a few pleasantries, leaned forward with an air of confidential disclosure. "It's the most curious thing," she said. "Inspector Graves told me last night that they've recovered one of the Gibraltar papers. Of course, he wouldn't tell me from whom, but I dare say it will all come out soon enough." It was entirely untrue, of course. No such paper had been found. But Mrs. Abernathy's reaction was telling. For the briefest moment, a flush rose high on her cheekbones and her eyes darted, not to Miss Marple, but to the mantel clock, as though calculating time. "How interesting," she said finally, her voice level again. "I can't imagine how that would be relevant to poor Mr. Price's death." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and left her to her thoughts. Her next call was on Major Ketteridge, whom she found in the billiards-room chalking his cue. She repeated the same invented news about the recovered paper. The Major froze mid-motion, his brows drawing together. "That's so?" he said slowly. "Well, that will put the cat among the pigeons. Some folk won't like that one bit." His eyes narrowed slightly, though at what, Miss Marple could not yet say. Finally, she found Evelyn in the small garden, pruning a rosebush with more force than necessary. The young woman's response was entirely different. She looked almost relieved. "Good," Evelyn said, clipping another thorny stem. "If it clears Captain Redfern's name after all these years, then it's worth whatever trouble it stirs. He didn't deserve what they did to him." Here, Miss Marple noted, was no flinch of guilt, only the unguarded rush of someone whose conscience had carried a long burden. But it was the fourth encounter, with Crawley the butler, that yielded the most unexpected crack. When she mentioned the supposed recovery, his silver-polished hands stilled. He looked at her sharply, his voice a whisper despite the empty room. "You mean, it's here? In the house?" Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. "Why would you think that?" His lips pressed into a thin line, but the slip was already made. He had not questioned whether the paper existed, only assumed it was nearby. That, to Miss Marple's mind, suggested knowledge far more intimate than any loyal servant should have admitted. That evening she wrote a note to Inspector Graves, asking him to gather everyone in the library the following afternoon. The pretext, she explained, would be to go over the sequence of events on the day of the murder. But her true purpose was quite different. She intended to stage a small test of character, one that would force the guilty party into revealing themselves. When the company assembled, Mrs. Abernathy composed, Ketteridge gruff, Evelyn watchful, Crawley silently efficient. Miss Marple produced a small brown envelope from her knitting bag. "I have here," she said, holding it up, "a document recovered by Inspector Graves and believed to be one of the missing Gibraltar papers. I shan't read it aloud, of course. That's for the authorities. but I thought it fair to let you all know that its contents may significantly change the course of this investigation." Her eyes moved from face to face, noting every flicker, every shallow breath. Mrs. Abernathy's hand tightened imperceptibly on the arm of her chair. Ketteridge's jaw set like stone. Evelyn's gaze darted toward her stepmother. And Crawley. Crawley's eyes fixed not on the envelope, but on the small writing desk in the corner, as though measuring the distance to it. Then, in a gesture as casual as she could make it, Miss Marple set the envelope on the desk and turned her back, asking Inspector Graves a question about alibi timings. It took less than 20 seconds. She heard the faint scrape of a chair, the soft pad of footsteps, the almost imperceptible rustle of paper. "Mr. Crawley," she said without turning, "do sit down again. I assure you the envelope contains nothing more than blank paper, but I'm afraid you've just told me more than enough." The butler froze, the colour draining from his face. Around the room, eyes widened. Mrs. Abernathy's were the widest of all. Miss Marple picked up the envelope and tucked it away. "Sometimes," she said gently, "a guilty conscience will do the work of half a dozen policemen." Now she knew. She still didn't have the whole picture, but she had the hand that had reached for the papers, and perhaps by extension, the hand that had silenced Mr. Price. The following morning, Inspector Graves arrived at the vicarage looking as though he had been awake all night. He wasted no time in pleasantries, only setting his hat on the table with a sharp motion and saying, "It's gone. The ledger from Colonel Abernathy's study vanished, and along with it the page we found hidden behind the false drawer." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "The page with the coded entries from Gibraltar?" "The very one. We'd locked it in the station's evidence room. Lock untouched, no signs of forced entry. Yet, when I opened the cabinet this morning, empty. It was, Miss Marple thought, not merely inconvenient, but deliberate. The loss of the ledger did more than remove a piece of proof. It unravelled the neat little chain of inferences she had begun to weave from Crawley's slip. Whoever had taken it was not acting in blind panic. They knew exactly what to remove and where it would hurt most. She accompanied Graves back to the Abernathy estate to see the study again, and it was there she first noticed the faintest hint of disturbance. On the carpet near the desk was a smear, pale grey, like dust from old paper rubbed into the pile. But the desk had been polished, the drawers immaculate. Someone had worked quickly and with precision, though in their haste they had failed to clean everything. Mrs. Abernathy received them in her sitting room, her manner as composed as ever, though her eyes held a wary glint. "I understand some things have gone missing," she said, a touch too casually. "Terrible shame, of course, but I do hope it doesn't hinder you, Inspector." Graves replied stiffly, "It hinders us greatly, madam." Miss Marple's gaze wandered over the silver tea service on the tray beside her. The sugar bowl's lid sat slightly askew, an odd thing for a woman so precise. On a whim she lifted it. Nestled among the sugar lumps was the stub of a pencil, worn to nothing, with a faint dusting of grey along its side, the same shade as the carpet smear. She replaced it without comment, her mind storing the connection away. Major Ketteridge was easier to read. When Graves told him about the missing ledger, he swore violently, insisting it proved his earlier claim that the whole business was a waste of time. "Someone's pulling your strings, Inspector. Best stop dancing before they tie them in a knot round your neck." Evelyn reacted with visible distress, pressing a hand to her mouth. "But if the ledger's gone, how will you prove anything?" she asked. It was not the words that struck Miss Marple, but the genuine note of fear, not for herself, she thought, but for what the loss might mean for someone else. Only Crawley seemed oddly calm. "I can't say I'm surprised, madam," he told Miss Marple quietly when they crossed paths in the hall. "Valuable things have a way of disappearing in this house." That remark pricked at her mind like a needle. It had the air of a warning, or perhaps a justification. By the afternoon, the mood in the village had shifted. Word of the missing evidence spread quickly, and with it came whispers that the police had bungled the whole affair. Miss Marple noticed the subtle changes, shopkeepers more guarded in their greetings, neighbours drawing their curtains when the inspector passed. The thief had not just stolen the ledger, they had stolen confidence in the investigation. That night, she sat at her writing desk, reviewing her notes. 3 names circled in her mind: Mrs. Abernathy, with her perfect composure and that misplaced pencil, Ketteridge, whose bluster might be a shield, and Crawley, who knew far too much and had shown a dangerous quickness to act. Yet the theft did not quite fit any of them cleanly. Then she remembered something Evelyn had said days ago when Miss Marple had asked about Colonel Abernathy's last weeks. He was sorting things for the solicitor. Papers everywhere. He hated untidiness, but he worked alone. If he had worked alone, then where had Crawley's knowledge of the hidden drawer come from? The theft, Miss Marple began to suspect, was not merely to remove proof, but to force the investigation to turn in circles, buying time for something else to happen. And time, in a murder case, was as precious a commodity as the evidence itself. Before she could think further, a soft knock came at her window. She opened the curtains to find Evelyn standing outside in her coat, eyes darting nervously toward the road. "I had to come," Evelyn whispered once inside. "It's not safe to talk at the house. I think someone followed me today, one of the Colonel's old associates. And I think—" She hesitated, then blurted, "I think the ledger wasn't stolen to hide the truth. It was stolen because of what's coming next." Miss Marple's hands paused over her knitting. "And what is that, my dear?" But Evelyn only shook her head. "If I tell you, you'll be in danger too." Outside, in the stillness of the lane, a shadow moved and vanished. Somewhere in the darkness, the hand that had taken the ledger was already preparing its next move, and Miss Marple understood with a chill that the game was no longer about finding the truth, but about keeping it alive long enough to be told. The morning after Evelyn's midnight visit broke damp and grey, the kind of weather that turned St. Mary Mead's lanes into narrow ribbons of mist. Miss Marple, wrapped in her thick cardigan, was pouring tea when a sharp knock rattled her front door. Inspector Graves stood on the step, face pale, his coat collar beaded with rain. "It's Crawley," he said without preamble. "We found him in the Abernathy greenhouse, quite dead." She set the teapot down slowly. "Dead, Inspector? How?" "A blow to the back of the head. No sign of a struggle, but the door was ajar. We think he was lured there." It was a bold move, reckless almost, and it told Miss Marple something important. The villain was not merely covering tracks. They were accelerating. The greenhouse was a humid, cloying place. The scent of damp earth and overripe tomatoes clung to everything. Crawley lay near a row of overturned pots, the back of his skull dark with dried blood. The scene was oddly neat, apart from one peculiar thing. A single carnation, its petals crushed, lay beside him. Miss Marple bent to pick it up. The stalk was snapped clean, as though yanked in. "Haste!" "Odd flower to find here," she murmured. "Colonel Abernathy never grew carnations, only orchids and tomatoes." Graves frowned. "You think it was brought here deliberately?" "Either that," she said softly, "or our murderer wears a boutonniere." While the constables took statements, Miss Marple's attention shifted to the witnesses. Mrs. Abernathy, pale but composed, claimed she had been in her bedroom with a headache. Major Ketteridge, all bluster and cigar smoke, insisted he had been walking by the river alone. No one to verify it. Evelyn was near tears, insisting she had not left her sewing room. But Miss Marple noted a change in Evelyn's manner, more defensive, almost brittle. She remembered the girl's warning the night before. It's not safe to talk. Perhaps Evelyn had been right to be afraid. Perhaps she had been the intended target. That thought was reinforced when Graves pulled her aside. "We found this in Crawley's pocket," he said, handing her a folded scrap of paper. In shaky pencil were the words, "Meet me by the glass house at 9. Urgent. The handwriting was unmistakably Evelyn's. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in her mind. If Evelyn had summoned Crawley, then either she was more deeply involved than she'd let on, or someone was skillfully framing her. And framing, she thought, required both planning and an understanding of the inspector's likely moves. That evening, Miss Marple took an uncharacteristic walk through the village lanes. She wanted to see if the murderer would follow patterns or break them. In mysteries, both in books and in life, the criminal often overreaches after a success. Her instincts were right. Near the vicarage gate she spotted a figure, too tall for Evelyn, too broad for Mrs. Abernathy, watching her from the shadow of a hedge. When she turned, the figure melted away into the fog, but not before she glimpsed a glint of something metallic in his hand. By the time she reached home, she had decided the killer was not merely removing threats, they were circling her. The proof came an hour later. She was settling by the fire when a stone smashed her parlour window, scattering glass across the rug. In its wake, a small envelope landed at her feet. Inside, on cheap-lined paper, were 2 words in block capitals: "Stop digging." Miss Marple read the note twice, her expression unreadable. Then she tucked it neatly into her knitting basket. If the villain believed threats would drive her away, they had chosen the wrong target. But privately, she felt the cold weight of urgency pressing harder. Crawley's death was no end. It was an opening gambit in a far more dangerous phase. The murderer was still several steps ahead. Yes, but the gap was closing. And if she didn't close it soon, Evelyn might be next. Outside, the fog thickened until the lane disappeared entirely, and somewhere in that grey shroud, the hand that had killed once already was waiting for the chance to strike again. The rain that had lingered since Crawley's death finally broke into a brittle, sunlit morning. Miss Marple sat at her small kitchen table, knitting untouched before her. She wasn't thinking about wool or drop stitches. She was thinking about carnations. It was such a minor thing, so minor that Graves had dismissed it outright. But she had learned long ago that small things, ignored by most, were often the very threads that held the truth together. The carnation in the greenhouse had not been grown there. It had been brought in from somewhere else, fresh enough that the petals were only just bruised. She recalled something from the funeral reception for Colonel Abernathy 2 weeks earlier. Major Kettridge had worn a carnation in his lapel, white and faintly scented. Odd for a man who professed a distaste for frippery. When she'd teased him about it, he'd replied with a laugh that one must keep up appearances. That same day, Mrs. Abernathy had remarked, in that airy, distracted way she had, that Kettridge always ordered his flowers from a particular florist in Market Chipping. A carnation was a poor thing to risk being remembered for, unless it had a use beyond ornament. Miss Marple began to list connections in her head. Crawley's death was meant to silence someone, or perhaps to silence what he had learned. Evelyn's note summoned him to the greenhouse, but the timing... Yes, the timing was peculiar. Graves had fixed Crawley's death between 9 and past, based on the cooling of the body. And yet, Evelyn had been seen at the vicarage around 9:15, delivering a basket of sewing men's. If Evelyn wrote the note, she had done so hours before, and someone else had seen it or intercepted it. That someone would need to know both her handwriting and her habits well enough to mimic her urgency without making her suspicious. Miss Marple thought again of Major Kettridge, how often he lingered near the Abernathy house, offering to help tidy up loose ends for the widow. How familiar he was with the layout of the property, including the greenhouse. But there was still Mrs. Abernathy herself. Her headache the night of Crawley's death could have been genuine, or it could have been a convenient absence. The widow's sudden composure, her refusal to break down even when speaking of her husband's violent end, had not escaped Miss Marple's notice. Neither had her habit of touching the gold locket at her throat whenever someone mentioned money. It was Evelyn, however, who unwittingly handed Miss Marple the clearest piece of the puzzle. That afternoon, while Miss Marple visited her under the pretext of delivering thread, Evelyn complained about the greenhouse mud ruining her shoes. She mentioned it had taken ages to scrub off the reddish stains. Miss Marple almost said it aloud then, but she held her tongue. The greenhouse earth was dark brown, almost black. The only reddish soil in the village was in the old potting shed behind the vicarage, abandoned for years except by one occasional visitor, Major Kettridge, who had been experimenting with tomato cuttings there in the summer. That was when the pattern clicked into place. The carnation was not the key in itself. It was the fingerprint of habit, the sort of thing a man like Kettridge would never think twice about. He wore one to Crawley's murder just as he wore one to the Colonel's funeral, as he wore one every Sunday without fail. And when Crawley fell, the stalk snapped, the flower dropped, and Kettridge never noticed. From that single slip, the rest of the picture emerged. Kettridge had intercepted Evelyn's note, used it to lure Crawley, and killed him to prevent whatever truth Crawley had unearthed about the Colonel's missing regimental funds. Mrs. Abernathy had played the helpless widow while quietly shielding the Major, likely out of loyalty, or perhaps for her own share of the gains. Miss Marple folded her hands, the pattern now almost complete. The only thing missing was proof strong enough to leave Graves no room for doubt. And if she knew men like Kettridge, they rarely confessed without a final push, especially when they believed themselves untouchable. That push, she decided, would have to come from her. The wind that evening was sharp, rattling the panes of Miss Marple's sitting room as she waited for her visitor. She had chosen her words carefully when inviting Major Kettridge for a little chat about some inconsistencies that have come to light. Men like Kettridge, she knew, disliked the idea of anyone, especially an elderly spinster, poking into their affairs. Curiosity would pull him in. Pride would keep him from declining. When he arrived, he carried himself with the same brisk, clipped precision he always had, hat perfectly angled, overcoat brushed free of lint, the inevitable white carnation in his buttonhole. Miss Marple poured tea as if this were a harmless social call, letting him talk about the weather, the dreadful decline in modern manners, the unreliability of the constabulary. All the while she studied him, his hands steady enough, but his eyes flickering ever so slightly when the conversation edged near Colonel Abernathy's name. At last she set down her cup. "You must forgive me, Major," she said softly, "but I've been thinking about that greenhouse, and about Sergeant Crawley's unfortunate demise there." Kettridge leaned back, smiling faintly. "A tragic accident of temper, I imagine. These country quarrels can be surprisingly heated." "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly. "But I wonder, did you find it difficult, carrying him all that way from the old vicarage shed?" The smile froze. He didn't speak, but the pause was enough to confirm she had struck the right chord. "You see," she continued, "the soil on Evelyn's shoes wasn't from the greenhouse at all, but from that very shed. And your carnations, Major, quite distinctive. The one found near the body had been bruised, the stem broken, as if during a struggle. Such a little thing, but flowers tell tales if one listens." Kettridge's fingers tightened around his teacup. "You've a lively imagination, Miss Marple." "Perhaps, but I also know why you did it." Her voice, still gentle, held an edge now. "It wasn't only the regimental funds. No. Crawley had learned about you and the Colonel's campaigns in Mesopotamia. About the village in ruins, the missing relief supplies, the whispers that certain officers profited handsomely while their men went hungry. He knew the Colonel had kept detailed notes that disappeared when the Colonel died. I believe you took those, and that Crawley confronted you." Kettridge's colour rose. "You've no proof." "Not yet," Miss Marple admitted. "But I've spoken with an old clerk from the War Office. He remembers the investigation, the one quietly closed before it reached a court-martial. He also remembers the name of the officer who vouched for the Colonel, preventing scandal. You, Major, and I think you've been collecting favours from that silence ever since." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, but an old, buried wound. "You think you understand," he said slowly. "But you don't. The Colonel saved my life. Twice. I owed him everything. When the War Office came sniffing around, I made sure his record stayed clean. And when the money went missing, yes, I helped him move it. Not for greed, for honour, for loyalty to the man who pulled me out of a trench when the rest had left me for dead. And when he died," Miss Marple said, "you saw to it that his widow was provided for, even if that meant continuing the arrangements. But Crawley threatened to undo it all." Kettridge's jaw tightened. He wasn't just threatening the money. He was threatening the Colonel's name. If that had been dragged through the mud, what would be left? A hero's grave turned into a scandal. I couldn't allow it. Not after all the Colonel had done for me. For the regiment. Miss Marple's voice softened, but not with sympathy. "So you killed for the sake of a memory, a reputation. You call it loyalty, Major, but it's still murder. And now you've put Mrs. Abernathy in danger of being dragged into it as well." He gave a short, humourless laugh. "She's stronger than you think. She understands. We were protecting something worth more than either of us." "Even if it costs more lives?" That struck him. His gaze dropped, and for the first time he looked older, shoulders slumping, the polished officer's bearing faltering. "No," he said finally in a voice like gravel. "No more." Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, signalling discreetly. Outside, Inspector Graves stepped forward from the shadows, 2 constables at his side. When she turned back, Kettridge had already placed his hands on the table, palms open. "I suppose," he said quietly, "it was bound to end this way." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. "It needn't have, but the past has a way of finding us, Major, especially when we've left loose threads behind." The constables led him out into the cold night. Miss Marple, left alone in the quiet parlour, reached for her knitting again. The carnation in Kettridge's lapel had fallen to the carpet. She bent, picked it up, and set it in the small vase by the window, where it would wither by morning, a reminder that even the most carefully tended facades cannot last forever. The morning was brittle with frost, each breath a pale cloud in the cold. Miss Marple sat at the far end of the Abernathy drawing-room, her knitting resting in her lap, the fire at her side barely crackling. Across from her, Mrs. Abernathy poured coffee with slow, deliberate grace, her pale fingers steady despite the knowledge that this would be no ordinary morning call. Inspector Graves stood near the door, silent but alert, and 2 constables lingered just outside. Every detail had been arranged, deliberately, precisely to create the right moment. Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Abernathy, like a moth too close to the flame, would either be drawn into confession or try to flee. "I must say," Miss Marple began in her usual mild tone, "it is a comfort to have this matter finally coming to a close. Major Kettridge has been most forthcoming." Mrs. Abernathy's smile was polite but tight. "Forthcoming?" "Yes. He explained a great many things, about the Colonel's activities during the war, about the money, and about your involvement." The teacup paused halfway to the saucer. "My involvement?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, as though remarking on the weather. "The Colonel's accounts, for instance. You kept them for him, didn't you? And after his death it was you who ensured certain arrangements continued. That would explain the peculiar entries in your household ledger. Entries you told the inspector were for charitable donations." Mrs. Abernathy set the cup down carefully. "Charities take many forms, Miss Marple, and they often require discretion." "Of course, and I dare say few charities require a forged signature from a deceased officer." Graves shifted slightly, the faintest creak of leather betraying his readiness. Miss Marple's voice stayed calm, almost grandmotherly. "You see, I've realized the truth was not entirely Major Kettridge's alone. The Colonel entrusted his profits to both of you. But after his death, you feared the trail might lead back to you if anyone discovered how they were acquired. That's why you and Kettridge both had reason to silence Sergeant Crawley." Mrs. Abernathy's eyes sharpened, her composure fracturing for the first time. Sergeant Crawley was a drunk and a blackmailer. He would have ruined everything my husband built. "And Evelyn Hardwicke?" Miss Marple asked gently. "She was no blackmailer. She simply stumbled upon something she shouldn't have seen." The room's quiet deepened until the tick of the mantel clock was the only sound. Mrs. Abernathy's voice, when it came, was brittle. "Evelyn wasn't supposed to be there that night. I went to fetch something from the shed, the Colonel's old case files. She must have followed me. When she saw what I was carrying, she began asking questions, demanding to know why those papers had been hidden. I panicked." Miss Marple said nothing, letting the silence stretch, letting the confession hang in the air until it felt too heavy to bear. "I told Kettridge," Mrs. Abernathy continued, "and he said he would take care of it. I thought he meant to reason with her. But instead," Miss Marple finished softly, "she became another casualty of the Colonel's secrets." The air shifted. Graves took one step forward. Mrs. Abernathy's eyes darted toward the French doors leading to the terrace, and for a heartbeat Miss Marple knew exactly what was about to happen. "Mrs. Abernathy," Graves warned. But she was already moving, fast, much faster than her delicate frame suggested, chair scraping back, skirts brushing the table as she dashed for the doors. She flung them open, cold air flooding the room, and made it halfway across the terrace before the constables intercepted her, each seizing an arm. The struggle was brief, a rustle of wool and the crunch of frost beneath boots. When they brought her back inside, her face was pale but composed again. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Running, my dear, is so rarely the solution, and it does rather suggest a guilty conscience. Mrs. Abernathy's voice was quiet, almost weary. It wasn't greed, Miss Marple. It was survival. After the Colonel died, I had nothing. No means, no security. If those funds had been exposed, I'd have been ruined. Society has little mercy for women in my position. Miss Marple met her gaze, her own expression one of sad understanding. Perhaps, but society also has little mercy for murder. And the truth, Mrs. Abernathy, is that both you and Major Kettridge chose to preserve a reputation at the cost of human life. Graves gave the signal, and the constables led her out, her footsteps echoing down the hall. When the house fell silent again, Miss Marple returned to her chair, picking up her knitting where she had left off. Through the window she could see the frost glittering on the garden path, the same path Mrs. Abernathy had tried to take toward escape. But in truth, there had never been anywhere for her to run. The net had been drawn too tightly, and Miss Marple, patient and precise, had always known exactly where it would close. Snow had begun to fall in soft, silent flurries by the time Miss Marple stepped out of the Abernathy estate. The air was sharp, and the village seemed unusually hushed, as though the world itself was ready to put the case to rest. Inspector Graves, standing beside the police car, gave a nod of quiet satisfaction. "A tidy job, Miss Marple. The Crown prosecution will be pleased. Mrs. Abernathy's confession, Kettridge's statement, open and shut." Miss Marple, tightening her scarf, merely murmured, "Perhaps." Graves frowned. "You sound unconvinced." "Oh, not unconvinced, Inspector. Simply cautious. Open and shut cases are rather like neatly wrapped presents. One must always check for false bottoms." He gave her a bemused look, but didn't press. The constables drove Mrs. Abernathy away, and the house grew still. Miss Marple began her walk back to the inn, snow crunching beneath her boots. It might have ended there, a clean finish, but she had taken barely a dozen steps before a voice called from the shadows, "Miss Marple!" The figure emerged from behind the gate, a young maid from the estate, face pale, breath clouding in the cold. "Please, ma'am, I didn't know who else to tell. You see, Mrs. Abernathy, she wasn't the one who brought the Colonel's files out that night." Miss Marple's knitting bag hung still at her side. "Go on." "It was the Major," the girl whispered. "He came 2 nights before, just after dark. I saw him slipping something into that old case in the shed. Then when Mrs. Abernathy went in, well, she found it." Miss Marple's mind began to turn, threads looping back over the entire affair. The Major had always been quick to assist, quick to confirm the inspector's theories. Too quick. "And this something he placed, did you see it?" she asked. The maid nodded. "It looked like papers, but there was something else. A photograph, I think. The corner of it was burnt." Burnt photographs. Miss Marple had seen one before, just a scrap, when the sergeant's effects were catalogued. Graves had dismissed it as accidental damage. But now... She thanked the girl and returned at once to the inn. Graves was still there, warming himself by the fire. "Inspector," she said briskly, "I must insist on seeing the evidence from Sergeant Crawley's case again. At once." Graves bristled. "Miss Marple, we've already—" "At once, Inspector," she repeated, the steel in her voice brooking no delay. When the box was brought, she sifted through it with delicate fingers until she found the scorched scrap. The image was faint, but the face, half obscured by flame, was unmistakable. Not the Colonel, not Mrs. Abernathy. Major Kettridge. It was an old photo, judging by the uniform and backdrop, but beside him stood a man Miss Marple knew from the village records, Evelyn Hardwicke's late father, a man who had died under mysterious circumstances during the Colonel's tenure. "Oh dear," Miss Marple breathed. "The war may be over, Inspector, but some battles never quite end." Graves leaned forward. "You think Kettridge—" "I think," she said softly, "that Mrs. Abernathy was not the mastermind at all. She was convenient, a scapegoat wrapped in silk and gilt. And the true hand directing all of this is still quite free." Within the hour they were back at Kettridge's lodgings. The Major answered the door with his usual smoothness, but the faint tightening around his eyes betrayed surprise. "Miss Marple," he greeted, "I assumed your work here was finished." "Not quite, Major," she replied sweetly. I'm afraid there's one last matter, about a certain photograph. His composure faltered. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do, she said, her voice sharpening just enough. It was you who planted the Colonel's files where Mrs. Abernathy would find them. You who fed her just enough truth to make her act in panic. And you who ensured Sergeant Crawley wouldn't live to tell the world what he'd discovered, that your dealings during the war were far less honourable than you'd have people believe. For a heartbeat silence. Then Ketteridge's expression shifted, not anger, but a slow, resigned smile. I underestimated you, Miss Marple. Yes, she agreed gently, you did. When the constable stepped in, he made no attempt to resist. As they led him away, he glanced back once. You could have let it rest. No one would have known. Miss Marple resumed her mild tone. But I would have known, Major, and that would never do. Later, as snow thickened and the lamps along the village lane began to glow, she sat by the inn's fire, knitting once more. The case was over now, truly over, and the neat wrapped parcel Graves had thought so tidy had revealed its hidden compartment after all. And in that quiet way of hers, Miss Marple thought how often the final truth comes not in the roar of confession, but in the whisper of something overlooked, until the very last moment. The trial of Major Ketteridge was a brisk affair in the eyes of the court, though for those in the gallery, Miss Marple included, it carried the weight of decades. The prosecution painted him as a manipulator, a man who had concealed wartime crimes beneath the cloak of service, and used others as pawns to protect himself. Mrs. Abernathy, pale and subdued, testified under oath that she had been guided by the Major to act in ways she thought would safeguard her late husband's reputation. Her eyes avoided the dock throughout. The jury was out for barely 2 hours, guilty on all counts. Inspector Graves exhaled in relief as the gavel fell. Well, that's that. Justice served. Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly over her knitting bag, gave the faintest of smiles. Yes, for what we can prove. Graves frowned. What do you mean? She glanced towards the door where the Major was being led away, chains clinking faintly against the stone floor. The man is guilty, Inspector, but he has been at this game for a very long time. You may have caught the fox in the henhouse, but I suspect he's hidden several hens elsewhere. Her words lingered with Graves as they left the court. But in truth, Miss Marple's mind was not on the hens. It was on the photograph. The scorched image had been the linchpin, yet even in revealing it, she'd been careful. She hadn't told Graves the entire story. That photograph had shown not just the Major and Evelyn Hardwicke's father, but a third man, half cut off by the frame, wearing the insignia of a foreign intelligence branch. Miss Marple had recognised him from a case she'd once helped with in London, a man thought dead since the late 40s. Dead men, she mused, have an uncanny habit of walking, if you're patient enough to watch the right shadows. 2 days later, she took tea at the Abernathy estate. Mrs. Abernathy was under no charges now, free to resume her life, though a faint sadness seemed to have settled in her eyes. I owe you a great deal, Miss Marple, she said quietly. If you hadn't, well, I might have spent the rest of my life in prison. You owe me nothing, Miss Marple replied, stirring her tea. But perhaps you might consider being more careful about whom you trust. People rarely change, you know. They only get better at hiding the parts of themselves they think will cause trouble. Mrs. Abernathy gave a bitter smile. I suppose I learned that the hard way. That evening, as Miss Marple packed her bag to return home, Graves arrived at the inn. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, about there being more to the Major's dealings. I checked into his wartime assignments. There are gaps in the records, big ones. Miss Marple looked up from folding a scarf. And you think you'll find what he was hiding? Graves shook his head. I think someone made sure I won't. She gave a small nod, as if she'd expected nothing less. You knew from the start, didn't you? Graves asked suddenly. That it wasn't Mrs. Abernathy? From the moment she offered me tea, Miss Marple said with a twinkle. Her hands shook only when she mentioned the Major. Guilt shakes all over, Inspector. Fear is far more selective. Graves chuckled softly. One day you'll have to tell me how you see these things. One day, perhaps, she said, settling into her chair. But if I told you now, you might stop looking for them yourself, and where would the fun be in that? The train the next morning took her away from the village, the frost outside melting into a misty dawn. Somewhere behind her, Major Ketteridge awaited sentencing. Whether he would serve his full term or find some clever way to shorten it, Miss Marple could not say. But she had seen enough to know this much. Justice, in the human sense, is rarely absolute. It comes in fragments, pieced together like an old quilt, and sometimes, despite one's best efforts, there are patches missing. Still, she thought, the fox was in the cage for now, and that would have to do. The countryside slipped past in blurred ribbons of frost and hedgerow as Miss Marple's train rattled towards St. Mary Mead. She sat with her knitting in her lap, though her needles moved only occasionally. Instead, her gaze rested on the countryside, her mind returning, unbidden, to the trial, the testimony, and the fragments of truth that still refused to settle neatly into place. It was not the verdict that troubled her. Major Ketteridge had been found guilty, and rightfully so. It was not Mrs. Abernathy who was free now, and would, Miss Marple hoped, find some quieter way to live. No, it was the photograph. She had shown only the corner with Ketteridge's face clearly visible, and the half-shadowed figure beside him had gone unmentioned in court. To have introduced that name now would have meant opening an entirely different case, one that would stretch far beyond the neat boundaries of this village affair. In her handbag, carefully wrapped in a piece of waxed paper, the photograph still sat. She had not returned it to Inspector Graves. She told herself it was for safekeeping, but she knew it was because something about that third man troubled her more than she cared to admit. The train slowed at a small rural station. A porter bustled past her window carrying a battered leather valise. As he did, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. On the bag's side was a faded customs tag, one she recognized instantly. It bore the insignia of the same foreign service that the man in the photograph had worn. The owner of the valise was a tall, thin gentleman with a courteous smile and a walking stick. He boarded briskly and by sheer chance chose the seat opposite hers. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. His accent was unplaceable, though there was a certain carefulness in the way he spoke, as if he'd spent a lifetime smoothing away the edges of his true voice. Miss Marple smiled in return. "Good morning. Off to London?" "Yes. And you, madam?" "Home," she replied, though her eyes had already noted the slight nick in his cuff, the military polish on his shoes, and the faint scent of tobacco, a very particular Balkan blend she had encountered only twice before, both times in connection with intelligence men. They spoke politely for a few minutes, nothing more than the weather and the timeliness of the train, but when the ticket inspector passed through, the gentleman presented his pass quickly, almost impatiently, and shifted his valise to rest against his leg. His fingers lingered protectively over the lock. Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking. She asked no further questions. She had learned long ago that silence often loosened more tongues than interrogation. At the next station he tipped his hat, bid her good day, and left the train. She watched from the window as he stepped onto the platform and disappeared into the fog. Only then did she notice the scrap of paper left on the seat he had occupied. It was a railway timetable, folded twice, with a single line written in neat slanted script. "Some foxes don't stay in cages." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into the same pocket where the photograph rested. Her station came soon after. She walked through the familiar lanes of St. Mary Mead, pausing to admire the last of the winter roses in a neighbour's garden. She let herself into her quiet cottage, lit the fire, and set the kettle on. Yet even as she settled into her chair, tea steaming gently in her cup, her thoughts drifted back to the note, the man, the valise, and the blurred edge of a photograph. The case of Major Ketteridge was closed in the eyes of the law, but Miss Marple knew, with the certainty of one who had spent a lifetime watching the little things others ignored, that threads left hanging were rarely accidents. Some mysteries, she thought, never really end. They simply wait, and she would be ready when the next one began.